Evil teeth, bribing voters, and a war that should never have happened. History reveals a dark side to the first U.S. president. Most people who have heard of George Washington have probably also heard of his wife Martha. As the original First Lady in United States history, she carries a pretty sterling reputation too, even if she and George never bore any biological children. It's worth mentioning, however, that Washington's heart may possibly have belonged to another, Sally Fairfax. Fairfax, the wife of one of Washington's old friends, had shown him the ropes of navigating the upper class and aristocracy around the colonies so as to fit in with the who's who of the eastern seaboard. But for Washington, his relationship with Sally Fairfax was more than just a learning experience. It was also a one-way love, as Washington had feelings for her before her marriage, and controversially, even after his own marriage to Martha. In the last letter Washington ever wrote to her, Washington confessed to the happiest years of his life being those he spent in her company. Oddly enough, this letter was co-written by Martha, who also enjoyed the company of the Fairfax family. While that doesn't technically make it a love triangle, it's not far off either. Of all the great myths surrounding George Washington, the true nature of his teeth may be the most mysterious. Washington had dental problems his entire life, despite dedicating much time and attention to the well-being of his chompers.
You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
But not even proper hygiene and care could keep those teeth in his mouth, and it became necessary for him to invest in dentures. Rumors have since blossomed that they were wooden teeth, but that isn't entirely true. In fact, his teeth were a mixture of different materials, the least flattering of which being the pulled teeth of enslaved people. Among Washington's documents to have survived into modernity is a receipt documenting his purchase of 9 teeth from this horrific source. And while it does seem to be particularly cruel and gross, Washington's estate has pointed out that this has been a common practice since the Middle Ages, with the poor selling their teeth to dentists for a decent price. Sometimes they were even taken from corpses. Whether that made it any more palatable, however, is up for some debate. One of George Washington's more controversial moments may be deserving of a pass, mainly because he actually tried to play the game right and avoid any of the underhanded political schemes that existed during his era. In the end, though, he discovered that the only way to win the game was to cheat, and that's exactly what he did. When Washington was 24 years old, long before he was a presidential candidate, he ran for a seat in the House of Burgesses and lost handedly. Washington blamed his defeat on the fact that he had refused to provide alcohol to his voter base. Naturally, his political opposition had merrily lubricated the innards of the voters. 2 years later, Washington ran for office again, this time providing 144 gallons of booze to voters, and he won very easily. It's fair to say, then, that Washington only entered politics in the very first place because he illegally bribed his voters with hooch. But hey, that's politics for you. People often gloss over George Washington's early days, despite being celebrated for his original thinking, cunning, and steadfastness in the so-called American way. His mind evolved ahead of its time, and his military prowess was so esteemed that he commanded a ragtag militia to victory over the most fearsome empire in the world. At least, that's how the story is usually told. Before all that, Washington made plenty of mistakes and missteps. At just 21 years old, as a young Army major, Washington was sent into Ohio Territory to face the French. However, Washington had never seen combat before, and he was accompanied by a veteran Native American warrior named Tanacharison, who likely had Washington wrapped around his finger. Seeing land he wanted for his people, Tanacharison instigated the conflict by pushing Washington into a skirmish with the French, leading to the conflict that began the French and Indian War. In one account, it was even Washington who fired the first shot.
Not only historically wrong, but hysterically wrong.
Sacre bleu!
What does that mean?
Sacred blue?
In what would nowadays be the tabloid flavor of the week, George Washington endured a potential scandal back in the mid-1780s involving a secret child he had with an enslaved woman. According to descendants of the child, Washington had an affair with a woman named Venus, who belonged to the widow of Washington's brother. The child's name was West Ford. The family maintains that Ford was treated favorably in the Washington household all his life because he was, in fact, the former president's illegitimate son. Piling on the proof, Ford was given 160 acres of land by Washington's ancestors, which was not exactly a common practice back then. Ford would use that gift to establish Gum Springs, a town of formerly enslaved people who had been granted their freedom. George Washington's estate has denied all claims, fortifying their stance around Washington having fathered nobody at all. Chances are we'll simply never know the real truth. One of the more contentious discussions surrounding the Founding Fathers is their involvement in slavery and how far each of them benefited from it. Sure, these were the families responsible for creating the nation, but the question remains of how much of that came down to their exploitation of human beings. No matter how well anyone treated the people they owned, it doesn't change the fact that they owned them. And while George Washington did change his views on slavery over the years, he still profited from the institution. Towards the end of his life, though, Washington worked tirelessly to secure his enslaved people's freedom. It is widely known that, in his will, he freed the enslaved people that were legally bound to him, but many were enslaved by Martha and the estate, and thus not his to free at all. Despite attempting to sell off his own land to compensate the estate, his best efforts failed. In the end, many of the enslaved at Mount Vernon remained as such long after the first president's death. As the most iconic figure in American history, George Washington is a tough man to criticize. Even when it comes to his dealings with slavery, his about-face later in life offers a glimmer of hope that this man had seen the error of his ways. There is another theater of cruelty, however, that doesn't offer as much hope regarding the president's character, that of the Native Americans and the treatment they endured at the hands of the United States government. When the colonial United States was still in its fledgling state, the Native Americans were the top dog in America. This meant that to steal their land, Washington had to get creative. While Washington noted that part of his goal in acquiring Native American land was to find a mutually beneficial relationship with the various tribes in the area, the goal rarely ever received any visitation. Instead, Washington would offer to buy Native American land in honest transactions and then fight them off their land if they refused. He made such a habit of this brutal policy that the Iroquois referred to him as Town Destroyer. As far as nicknames go, it's not the most flattering. Religion was a coy subject for George Washington, either because he didn't want his beliefs known or because he didn't adhere to any of the organized religions of the time. Whatever the case, George Washington's spirituality is not as easy to pin down as many of his contemporaries. During the Revolutionary War, Washington attended services alongside his fellow military men, but Washington's manner of faith changed when he entered office. While he sought to protect the religious freedoms of all religions, Washington only attended church about once a month when he settled back into life at Mount Vernon post-presidency. He was also ambiguous in his writings over details of his personal religious beliefs. Washington has been declared an Anglican by his estate at Mount Vernon, but he was also a Freemason, an organization that shares many of the same core principles. His dedication and active membership in the Masons, along with some of the disdain he showed towards some Christian church rituals, have led some to speculate that he was more of a deist than anything else. Nevertheless, trying to categorize Washington's religion requires an appreciation for the complex and nuanced nature of his spirituality. No one can escape library late fees, not even the first president of the United States. On October 5, 1789, George Washington checked out two books, The Law of Nations by Emmerich de Vattel and Volume 12 of Commons Debates, a transcript of various historical debates from the British House of Commons. The librarian signed them out rather simply to President. Less than a month later, the books were due, and Washington made no attempt to return them. From November 2, 1789, the fines began to mount. 2.5 years later, the first book recording his fines, now weighing 18 pounds, was retired and subsequently went missing. Fast forward to 1934, and the ledger was found in the library's basement. In 2010, it was confirmed that Washington never did return his library books because Volume 12 of Common Debates turned up, and not in the library. With the fines now amassing $300,000 and Washington long dead, it seemed that all was now at an impasse. Mount Vernon, however, had other ideas. While they couldn't track down Washington's copy of the Law of Nations, they did manage to purchase another for $12,000 online, which they then donated to the library, leading to the absolution of Washington's fines. In this one, George Washington bears no fault. Well, not much fault anyway. In 1797, Martha Washington wrote a lighthearted letter to a friend that mentioned her husband had entered into an agreement with a handful of other men, stipulating that none of them should die before 1800. In her letter, Martha seemed confident that there was no reason to worry about her dear George. Yet, sure enough, just 17 days shy of 1800, Washington kicked the bucket. That's when things got a little weird. At the time, there was great concern about burying people alive, so Washington's friends and family let the bodies sit there for another couple of days, just to be sure he was actually dead. When Washington was dying, one Dr. William Thornton had been invited to the home to try his luck at curing him, but Thornton arrived too late. But that didn't dissuade him from trying to do his best for the late president. Thornton brought with him a backup plan that involved step after step of detailed instructions on how to bring Washington back from the dead.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
He even proposed this idea to all those gathered, but no one was particularly keen, so he never had a chance to try it out. But maybe that's for the best. It's often said that no one becomes a president of the United States for the money. After all, while U.S. presidents make a comfortable sum as part of their salary and expenses, they are by no means the top of the capitalist pyramid in America. And while there have obviously been pay raises in the presidential earnings over the years, a president's earnings can be entirely dependent on how much America as a nation is making. In 1789, George Washington's salary was 2% of the budget of the United States of America, an idea which is simply unthinkable nowadays, considering modern-day figures now run into trillions of dollars. In addition, Washington was a considerably wealthy landowner, with close to 60,000 acres to his name, including 8,000 acres of prime farmland along the Potomac River. Altogether, and adjusted for inflation, this puts Washington at an estimated $678 million net worth, which makes him one of the richest Americans ever, let alone presidents. In case you're wondering, Thomas Jefferson was worth some $274 million, despite his many debts, while John Adams amassed only $25 million, a mere fraction of Washington's staggering fortune.